of the first things writers will do in any story is make you feel for the main character. This is one of the reasons that agents generally don't like prologues, assuming that the prologue is not based on the main character. And the way writers often try to make you feel for a character is by making them relatable, at least in some way. I often see a lot of comments on certain shows saying that people didn't like it because none of the characters were relatable. And while not all the characters need to be relatable for the viewer to care about them, and a character doesn't need to be wholly relatable, but more a certain aspect of that character needs to be relatable in some way. Ideally, for example, the character Silco in Arcane, acting like a father to Jinx, makes him relatable to us, as most people either grew up with a father figure or are fathers themselves. Another trick writers use is usually to put the main character as the underdog, which I'm sure is relatable to people everywhere, unless somehow you're the best at everything you've ever done. This, along with another technique, is how we are introduced to Vi and Powder. The two of them are walking through a war zone, where a battle is only just ending. We don't know why this has happened, or what they are doing there. What we do see is Powder singing, one hand over her eyes, and another clasped onto Vi's. We can infer from this that Vi has made Powder do this to keep her calm. The eyes to stop her from seeing the bodies, and the singing, something familiar, to keep her from freaking out. This displays her protectiveness of her sibling, a relatable trait. A man who we later find out to be Vander appears to be the sole survivor, though he does not appear happy at what has happened. It's clear that he knows Vi and Powder, and realises why they have come to the battlefield, because he nods towards some corpses of whom are Vi and Powder's parents. Vi breaks down crying, and Powder, the younger of the two sisters, who's likely too young to contemplate what is happening, starts to comfort Vi. Vander looks at his gauntlets for a brief moment before discarding them, perhaps realising the folly of war, and maybe even blaming himself for the battle. He carries Vi and Powder away, perhaps because he knows them, but I believe that it is at least partly because he feels responsible for their parents' deaths. And as he walks away, Vi looks back at the soldier, disappearing back into the fog, and the city of Piltover in anger, something that will justify her actions later. As I mentioned before, here we see these characters at their lowest. And not only that, but we see their motivations and powerful resolves to let us know exactly who these characters are and what they fight for. We can also emphasize with them for their relatable traits of protection, responsibility, and sadness. And all of this is done without words. Show, don't tell is a powerful form of storytelling, which is used a lot throughout Arcane. And this opening scene is a perfect example of how to do it well. Really getting us to feel the emotions of these characters, and even making us care for them more by forcing the viewer to think about why all of this has happened, and why they could be feeling this way. We have expended effort on them, and thus we feel attached to them, if only by a little. In this opening shot, one of the first things we see is Vi, and we can instantly tell that years have passed since that opening scene of Arcane. The opening shot of the city indicates a more peaceful time, the climb they just made up indicating that where they live is below, and that they took the scenic route to get to where they are now. Another good example of show don't tell here. We haven't been told what they are doing, but by the fact that they are climbing over rooftops, we can tell that it is something illegal. Remember the justification I mentioned before? Well, did anyone think that they are the bad guys during this section? We're not thinking about who could get hurt from their actions, or what the person who gets robbed will feel like. We're thinking that their actions are justified. This opening scene also doubles as showing us, without telling the situation that they are in, that their living conditions are poor, and in contrast shows us the typical living conditions of someone in Piltover, as this penthouse is one of the only houses we see, and every house we do see in Piltover is very, very high class. Finally, this scene triples as being the inciting incident, the moment in time that something happens that causes everything in the rest of the story to happen. But we will talk about more on that in our analysis of episode 2. Powder finds the Hextech crystals and drops one, creating a massive explosion. The alarm sounds and the four run back to the Undercity. We see here that Milo immediately looks to Powder when blaming someone for what happened. This is just the first instance, but sets up for later and introduces the group dynamic of Milo blaming and not getting along with Powder. Vi immediately pulls the group back together, taking neither side but reminding them of what they have just accomplished, setting her as the leader of the group. After leaving Piltover, the difference of Zaun's underground streets is immediately apparent. Broken windows and deserted streets. Very likely the place trash is dumped, and a sense of danger we did not have in Piltover. Again, all being shown without a word being said. Clagger interrupts Vi, saying that they don't want trouble. This paints Vi as a bit of a hothead, someone who is hot-tempered and quick to action, whereas Clagger is painted as the thinker of the group. Someone who would rather defuse the situation peacefully than fight. Deckard, a street thug, stops them and asks for a piece of what the group managed to steal from the apartment. Vi getting the first blow emphasises her hot-headedness, but also shows us that this is not the first time she has been in a fight. The brawl itself shows us that even the scrawny Milo can fight. The group obviously being used to it, however this scene emphasises Powder in particular. She is left out of the fight, time slowing to show the brutality of the scene, but also to emphasize Powder's heart rate, the adrenaline pumping through her system and what she is feeling and seeing in that moment. Being younger, she cannot fight like the others, and this is made all the more obvious by the fact that there are 4 thugs and 4 of our main group. Powder is not used to fighting, and thus her family is having to fight harder on her behalf. This knife scene is interesting. We learn some more little tidbits about Deckard in later episodes, which I believe gives extra context to this scene, and hints that the writers have developed even characters like this to be more than just a thug. So I'll revisit this later. Anyway, remember how Milo blamed Powder before? Again showing her inexperience and young age. She chooses to throw away the loot and escape rather than fighting over it. Now we see firsthand why Milo says she jinxes every job. This scene is also the first scene we see Powder fight, or at least tries to. She has a makeshift nail grenade, which she tries to use on the thug, however it doesn't work. This is very simple foreshadowing, which happens a lot and is open, which is often meant to give anticipation to the viewer, as opposed to more hidden foreshadowing that is often used for setting up plot twists. In this case, it is the anticipation that Powder's devices will work in the future, and when that happens, she will become a part of the group. What I really like about this setup is how excellently the writers use this to subvert these expectations, but more about this on episode 3. The lift down is a nice transition, showing us the true city of Zaun. The makeshift bridges and homes built along the side of a crevasse. The colour tone is darker and greener, and there is a noticeable lack of sunlight. Steam wafts from pipes that are jutting out everywhere. Shop stalls line the ground level, the owners brandishing weapons and giving nasty looks. Brothels are located on the main street, showing that in Zaun there is no restraint. Here we are reintroduced to Vander, who is keeping the law, and showing just the kind of power he has in Zaun. Notice how he sits next to Huck, the man with the glasses, and not in the centre of the table, clearly taken aside. This, along with the other members in the bar, all having his back, shows the kind of man he is without it needing to be said. This scene shows Vander as a father figure. We already see him take responsibility in that opening scene of Arcane, but now we get to see exactly the kind of father figure he is. And it's easy to see by how they talk to each other how much he cares for the children and how much they respect him. He tells Vi that fighting will not solve problems, but only make more of them, a lesson we saw him learn, and that the enforcers will come if they become a problem for Piltover. Another scene here building up Powder's mental state. She hears her sister agree with Milo that she can't do what the rest of the group can do. The fact that she leaves before hearing that her sister didn't actually mean what she said. The fact that this happens, that at least a part of her mental state is degrading due to misunderstanding, hints a little bit that we might be looking towards a tragedy happening. Here we are introduced to Benzo, a by-day pawn shop dealer and by-night, I guess, informant. It's not exactly made too clear, but he seems to be an informant for, like, dangerous jobs. And we see how close Vander is to Benzo, which immediately makes us care for Benzo. This is another little trick that we'll talk about in episode 2. We are also introduced to Echo, aka Little Man, who works for Benzo and appears to be friends with the group. A nice little touch, I thought, is this scene actually goes out of the way to fill in any kind of plot holes that this first episode might have, by informing us that it was Echo that gave them the tip about the penthouse and how exactly he found the whereabouts of the penthouse to begin with. All of this information is also given very naturally. It's not exactly an info dump, but sometimes when a character delivers information like this, it can come off very unnaturally. Arcane does another excellent job of making it all feel natural. Marcus' role in the scene is important, as he is needed for us to see what the general enforcer thinks of Zaun. His part is quick, but he has already shown us in this instance what Piltover and the rest of the enforcers think of them. This also works in contrast to the enforcer chief Grayson, who is calmer and more familiar with Vander. She shares a different view of Zaun compared to the rest of the enforcers, which is apparent by the way she interacts with Vander. And if all of this was obvious to you as the viewer when you were watching this episode, it shows just how good the writing was in this episode, that it was able to convey all of this information to you without getting the characters to say any of it. Vi looks out for Powder and shows her that everyone, even Milo and Clagger, and even herself, can make mistakes. She points out her favourite toy that was thrown up out of her reach. And Powder in turn shows Vi the hex tech that she still has in her pocket. But the two of them choose to keep it a secret between them. Vi tells Powder that she's stronger than she thinks and that one day the city will respect them.
One day, this city's gonna respect us.
Here we're introduced to Silco for the first time. A nice little trick the writers do is use Deckard, the thug we met earlier, to introduce Silco, as we learn that Silco was the one who told Deckard to keep a watch over them, immediately creating this connection from the group to Silco. As soon as the information about what the kids did is given, he notes that Vander is in trouble. This immediately forms a link in your mind of when Vander mentions that there are worse things out there, letting us know that these two might very likely know each other and have some kind of history with one another. And that the wound on Silco's face is likely connected to it.
Vander's in trouble.
Someone on our side. Who? There's worse things than enforcers out there.
And again, all of this with only the very smallest of information. We see the experiment he and the Doctor are working on and begin to worry for Vander and the kids. This is a pretty good introduction to a villain of whom we don't know anything about their character. All we know is that they are bad and want to do bad things. But rather than making the villain's motivation about destroying a city that we likely don't care for at this moment, they make his motivation about harming the characters that we do care about. They make his motivation personal. And I think this in our eyes makes him a more dangerous and threatening villain, because he is threatening something that we, as the viewer, directly care about. And none of this is explicitly said, but all implied and hinted at through pieces of information given through the story. So here I've made a character map of the first episode, and I wanted to highlight this briefly for the first episode. I will be adding to this character map as we go on, and I wanted to really just point out how the characters are introduced throughout this first episode, and this also kind of applies for how they're introduced throughout the series. We start with Vander, Jinx, and Vi. Or Vander, Powder, and Vi, I should say. Who are our kind of three main characters, who we are the first three characters that we are introduced to. Kind of Milo and Clagger, but mainly Powder, Vi, and Vander. And every character that has been introduced in this episode is related to them in some way, or introduced to us in some way. Benzo is introduced to us via Vander, that we know he is Vander's old friend, and Echo is an employee for Benzo. Grayson, who is the police chief, is introduced to us through Vander, and Marcus through Grayson. And then finally, Deckard here is introduced to us through his fight with Powder and Vi and the rest of the group, but he links off into Silco, who we know has a mystery connection with Vander at this point, and then the Doctor, who also works for Silco, and we'll see more how this expands throughout the series, and I'll get into more of it in a later episode, but also how the narrative, who we get the characters we focus on, start off with our main characters and then slowly branch more and more out as we go. But we will see more about that in episode 2. So this has been my analysis on the writing of episode 1. There are a lot of techniques and really smart writing displayed in this episode. If you enjoyed that, I am planning on doing analysis for episode 2, so please subscribe to the channel if you want to be notified when that gets released. This has been That's Rich. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.